They say the battlefield reveals who you really are. But my battlefield started in the dining room of my childhood home. My name is Madison Carter, but most people call me Maddie. I am 32, a major in the United States Air Force. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, in a house that smelled like black coffee and gun oil, a house where discipline was the language we spoke. My father, a retired Marine Corps sergeant, believed that respect was earned through obedience, and my mother followed his lead with quiet, determined eyes. But in our home, respect was something my brother Brandon never had to earn. It was given to him polished and framed on the mantle alongside his medals. Brandon is 34, a captain in the Air Force and what my parents call a true American hero. At every dinner, they would lean in to listen as he spoke about his flight missions, about the promotions he was chasing, about the generals who shook his hand. They called him our pride, and in that same breath they would glance at me with a polite smile. Sometimes my mother would ask, "Have you heard about your brother's new post, Maddie?" before moving on to the next story about Brandon's triumphs. I would nod, pretending it didn't sting, pretending it didn't feel like I was disappearing in my own home. But I didn't join the Air Force to follow in Brandon's footsteps. I joined because I needed to hear my name and know it mattered, to stand under the vast Texas sky and feel like I owned a piece of it. I became a reconnaissance pilot, the kind who flies low over foreign soil, gathering intelligence, reading the terrain, and making hard calls when no one else could. I wasn't loud, I didn't command attention with easy charm like Brandon, but I earned the respect of my team, one mission at a time. Back home, though, it didn't matter. At Christmas, our living room would fill with relatives praising Brandon's photos in uniform, his certificates hanging in glass frames on the hallway wall. I searched for even one photo of me in my flight suit, but there was none. One evening, I called home after a long day on base, hoping to hear a normal conversation, something simple like, "How are you, Maddie?" Instead, my mother answered, breathless, telling me how Brandon had just been selected for a new command role. They were planning a dinner to celebrate him. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the walls too quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound keeping me company. I watched the shadows move across the floor, wondering if there would ever be a day when they would say my name with pride the way they said his. A week later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The paper was heavy, official, the kind you open carefully. It was an invitation to Brandon's promotion ceremony at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. My mother had written a small note at the bottom. "We hope you can make it, Maddie." I held that letter for a long time, turning it over in my hands as the evening light fell across the room. I told myself that maybe this was their way of including me, of seeing me finally. I packed my uniform, carefully pressing every crease until it was perfect, the way Dad always said it should be. I booked a flight and stared out the window as the plane lifted off the clouds, swallowing the ground below. My stomach tightened with something I couldn't quite name, a mix of hope and fear. I arrived early on the day of the ceremony. My shoes shined, my ribbons aligned, my hair tied back in a perfect regulation bun. I walked toward the entrance with the letter in my hand, feeling like I was 12 again, hoping someone would notice I was there. But as I stepped up to the check-in table, the young airman looked at me, then at his list, then back at me. I watched his finger move down the page, stopping to scan, then moving again. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice careful, respectful. "You're not on the list." I blinked, tightening my grip on the invitation in my hand. "That's impossible," I said quietly. "I have the invitation right here." He glanced at it, then at the list again. "If you're not on the list, I can't let you in." I turned, looking through the glass doors, seeing my parents inside, my mother fixing Brandon's collar, my father standing tall with pride in his eyes. The room was warm with laughter and voices, a world I was not allowed to enter. I swallowed, my throat tight, the air heavy. It was in that moment, standing outside my brother's ceremony, that I realized something I could never forget. I stood there holding that invitation like it was proof I existed, but the airman didn't look at me again. He just nodded to the next person in line, his duty done, his eyes shifting away. I stepped back out of the line, the chatter of families and the rustle of uniforms pressing against my ears. My hands felt cold even in the Virginia heat, and I stared down at the neat letters of my mother's handwriting on the invitation. "We hope you can make it, Maddie." A part of me wanted to push past the doors, to call my mother, to demand why my name wasn't there, why I wasn't worth a single checkmark on a list. But I didn't. I stood there breathing in the heavy air, letting the truth settle on my shoulders. I could see Brandon through the glass shaking hands with officers, his smile easy and confident. My father stood beside him nodding proudly as people approached, his back straight, the same way he used to stand at my brother's football games, the same way he never stood for me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from my mother. "We're inside, dear. Let us know when you arrive. Brandon is so excited." I stared at the message, my reflection in the glass merging with the scene inside like I was a ghost hovering outside their perfect picture. My fingers hovered over the keyboard wanting to say I'm here, but they won't let me in. Instead, I turned the phone off and slipped it back into my pocket. I walked to a bench near the parking lot, sitting down carefully, the crisp fabric of my uniform brushing against the rough wood. I watched families walking in, mothers fixing ties, fathers giving last-minute advice, and children holding small American flags. I thought about all the times I had tried to earn this moment, the times I had flown missions at dawn, eyes burning from lack of sleep, the nights I spent studying every map, every protocol, every emergency landing procedure just to prove I was worthy of wearing this uniform. I thought about the day I earned my flight wings, how I stood on the parade ground searching the crowd for my parents. They came, but they left quickly after the ceremony, saying Brandon had a game that afternoon and they couldn't miss it. I thought about the first time I had to call in a medevac, my voice steady over the radio, while my hands shook on the controls, guiding the helicopter through dust and chaos, praying I wouldn't lose another soldier on my watch. And now I was here in the same uniform at the same base, and I wasn't on the list. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of jet fuel and cut grass. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of engines and distant laughter drift around me. I thought about leaving, about driving to the small motel I had checked into the night before, about forgetting this day ever happened, but I didn't move. I waited until the ceremony started, until I could hear the muffled sounds of applause and the soft echo of a microphone inside. I waited until I saw Brandon walk up to the stage, his posture perfect, his smile bright as my father patted his shoulder. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Maybe for someone to notice me, to step outside and look for me, to say, "We forgot your name, but you belong here." No one came. I stood up, brushing off my uniform, and took one last look through the glass doors. My mother was standing beside my father now, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes on Brandon as he spoke to the crowd. I turned away, walking back toward the parking lot, each step heavy but certain. The invitation crumpled in my hand, and I let it drop into the trash can by the sidewalk. I reached my car and sat in the driver's seat, closing the door, shutting out the sound of the ceremony. My hands rested on the steering wheel, and for a long moment I just sat there breathing, studying myself. That day, I promised myself something. I promised that if they couldn't see me now, they would see me someday, not because I demanded it, but because I would become someone they could no longer ignore. What would you have done if you were me? Have you ever been in a situation like this? Share in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. I started the engine, pulled out of the lot, and didn't look back. Because this was only the beginning. I stood at the gate, my uniform pressed sharp, and they asked me, "Who are you?" The morning air was cool, the kind that smells like wet asphalt and fresh grass. I held the invitation in my hand, the heavy paper creased from where my fingers had pressed too hard on the edges. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than words and a date. Langley Air Force Base stood tall before me, flags waving softly in the breeze, the hum of jets in the distance reminding me why I wore this uniform in the first place. Families walked past me laughing, adjusting ties, holding small hands of children in tiny dress shoes. I took a breath and stepped forward toward the check-in table. The young airman behind it looked no older than 20, his buzz cut sharp, his eyes scanning the line. "Next," he said. I stepped up, offering the invitation with a small nod. "Madison Carter," I said. He took the paper, glancing at it before turning to the list on his clipboard. His finger moved down the rows of names slowly, carefully, and then back up again. I could hear the shuffle of feet behind me, the quiet cough of a child, the low murmur of a mother telling her son to stand still. The airman looked up, his eyes soft but careful. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "I don't have you on the list." I blinked, the words not sinking in for a moment. I glanced at the invitation, then back at him. There must be a mistake, I said. My mother sent me this. She told me to come. He looked again, flipping a page, checking a second list, but I could see it in the way his shoulders dropped. I'm really sorry, ma'am, but if you're not on the list, I can't let you in. I turned my eyes, catching on the glass doors leading into the hall. Inside, I could see them, my family. My mother in her pale blue dress was fixing Brandon's collar, her hand brushing down the front of his uniform as he smiled and laughed with a group of officers. My father stood tall beside them, his hand on Brandon's shoulder, nodding with pride. A wave of warmth from the inside fogged the glass, blurring their faces for a moment before clearing again. I could see them so clearly, their world bright, safe, full of laughter and applause I could only hear in muffled pieces. I stepped back from the table, the invitation still in my hand. My fingers trembled slightly, and I curled them into a fist around the paper, feeling it crumple, the sharp edges pressing into my palm. I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialing my mother's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before her voice came on, cheerful and warm in her recorded message. Hi, you've reached Carol Carter. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. I hung up before the beep, swallowing the tightness in my throat. I tried my father's number next, but it went straight to voicemail. The air around me felt heavy, pressing against the seams of my uniform. I could hear the laughter from inside as someone opened the door, letting the sound spill out before it closed again, leaving me in silence. A small boy tugged at his father's hand, pointing at the jets taking off in the distance. I watched them, the engines roaring, cutting through the sky, with ease going places I once dreamed of reaching. The airman behind the table glanced at me, then quickly looked away, focusing on the next family stepping forward, checking their names, letting them in. I stayed there, holding the phone in my hand, staring at the glass, waiting for something, anything. A callback. A wave from my mother. Brandon turned to look and see me. No one turned. No one called. I lowered the phone, the screen dark against my palm, and let out a slow breath I didn't know I was holding. I stood there just outside the door, while the world I fought to belong to moved on without me. I could have walked away right then, back to my car, back to the quiet motel room that smelled like stale coffee and cheap soap. But I didn't. I stood there, feeling the invitation in my hand, the paper soft now from how hard I was holding it. The sun was rising higher, warm on the back of my neck, but it didn't reach the cold settling in my chest. A woman walked past me, her daughter holding her hand, wearing a tiny dress with white shoes that tapped softly on the pavement. She looked at me and smiled, not knowing what she was smiling at, just polite, just passing through. I tried to smile back, but it didn't reach my eyes. I glanced at the glass doors again, and for a moment I saw Brandon laugh. His head tilted back, teeth flashing, the easy kind of laughter that comes from knowing you belong. My father clapped him on the back, pride clear in the way he stood, shoulders straight, chin lifted. I shifted on my feet, the gravel crunching under my boots. A part of me wanted to walk up to the door, push it open, step inside, and stand there until someone saw me. Until someone said my name. But another part of me knew it would mean nothing. It would be like every other time, every other dinner, every other phone call, where they asked, "Have you heard about your brother, Maddie?" The young airman at the table stole a glance at me, then looked away quickly, pretending to check his list. Again. I wondered if he felt sorry for me standing there in full dress uniform, nowhere to go. I pulled my phone out again, scrolling to my mother's contact, staring at her name. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I didn't press it. Instead, I opened my text messages. "I'm here, but they won't let me in." I stared at the message, reading it over and over before I hit send. I waited, the screen glowing in my hand, the dots appearing and disappearing, the empty promise that someone was typing. Nothing came back. A family walked past me, the father in uniform, the mother adjusting the boy's tie, the child holding a small flag, waving it gently as they moved toward the doors. The airman checked their names, nodded, and let them pass. The doors opened, warm air and laughter spilling out, and then closed again, leaving me in the silence of the sidewalk. My phone buzzed, and I felt hope, quick and sharp. It was a message from my mother. "Call you later, sweetie. We're getting ready to start." I read it again, the words burning in my chest. I looked at the glass doors, at my reflection superimposed over Brandon's smile, and I understood. They didn't see me. They never had. I looked down at the invitation crumpled and bent the printed words smudged from the sweat of my palm. I smoothed it out looking at the date, the time, the location, the promise of belonging that was never meant for me. A breeze picked up rustling the paper, lifting the edges as if to take it from me. I let it fall watching as it drifted down landing softly on the table in front of the airman. He looked up his mouth opening like he wanted to say something, but I didn't wait. I turned away the sound of my boots steady on the pavement, each step a reminder that I was leaving a piece of myself behind, but I was also taking something with me. I was taking the promise that one day they would see me. I didn't look back at the glass doors. I didn't need to. I walked toward the parking lot, the sun higher now, the sky bright, the promise of another day waiting. And as I opened the door to my car sliding into the driver's seat, I felt the weight of that day settle on my shoulders, but I didn't let it break me. Because in that moment, I understood something I would never forget. What would you have done if you were me? Have you ever been in a situation like this? Share in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. This was the day I realized I had never really been invited. And it was the day I promised I would never need an invitation again. To understand why I disappeared, you need to know about that mission. The mission that changed everything. It was a year before the ceremony, and I was stationed at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, leading a reconnaissance flight team over the mountains where the dust never settled, and the air always smelled like jet fuel and sunburnt sand. My days were filled with flight plans, weather reports, and the constant hum of engines warming on the tarmac before dawn. I had learned to trust my instincts, to listen to the quiet voice that told me when to pull back, when to wait, when to watch longer before acting. We were gathering intel on a suspected weapons convoy moving through the valleys at night, slipping between the shadows using the mountain passes as cover. My team and I had tracked them for weeks, learning their patterns, planning the best window to intercept without losing the advantage of the dark. That morning, just after sunrise, Brandon arrived at our hangar fresh from a convoy, stepping out of a blacked-out SUV with that easy confidence that seemed to follow him everywhere. He was newly assigned as Tactical Operations Coordinator for our sector, a position that gave him authority even though he had never flown a single recon mission over these mountains. He walked in like he owned the place, nodding to my crew, shaking hands with officers, his uniform crisp, his boots clean, the smile on his face effortless. "Hey sis," he said, dropping his duffel with a thud. I didn't look up from the map spread across the table. "Brandon," I said, keeping my voice even. He leaned over, scanning the routes I had marked, the supply lines we suspected, the fallback zones we had planned in case things went sideways. "You're planning the intercept for Thursday," he said, tapping the map with his finger. "That's the window," I said. "Satellite cover, weather conditions, troop positioning, all aligned then." He nodded, but I saw the impatience in his eyes. "We should move sooner, Maddie," he said, standing straight, his arms crossing. I looked at him, shaking my head. "We need the intel to be solid, Brandon. We only get one shot at this." He smiled, the kind of smile that made people trust him, but I had seen it too many times to be fooled. "Sometimes you wait too long," he said, "and the opportunity slips away." I kept my eyes on him, feeling the weight in the room shift. "It's not about speed," I said. "It's about precision." He laughed softly, glancing around as if to invite the others to agree. "Speed is precision, Maddie, if you know what you're doing." I clenched my jaw, the tension in my neck rising. "Brandon, I'm the one flying the mission. I'm the one responsible for the team out there." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "And if you pull this off sooner, you'll prove what you're really capable of." "You've been waiting for that moment, haven't you?" I froze, hearing the words hit exactly where he meant them to. He knew I had spent my whole career trying to step out of his shadow, trying to be seen for who I was, not just as his sister. He saw the hesitation in my eyes, and he pressed again. "Don't let fear hold you back, Maddie. You know how Dad is. He respects bold moves." The mention of Dad made my chest tighten. The image of him standing tall, nodding in approval, was something I had chased for too long. I looked back at the map, the lines, the notes, the risks I had written in the margins. I could feel my instincts screaming to wait, to hold the line, to trust the timing. But his words echoed louder. "If you don't do it, someone else will." I looked up, meeting his eyes, seeing the certainty there, the unshakable confidence that had always made him the center of every room. And I nodded. "All right," I said quietly. "We'll move the timeline up." His smile widened and he clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You won't regret this, Maddie." But even as he walked away, calling back over his shoulder about meeting with command, I felt it. The tight pull in my stomach, the quiet voice I had always trusted telling me I had just made a mistake. I didn't know then that this decision would cost me everything. I spent that night at the hangar alone, staring at the map lit by a single desk lamp. The engine sounds outside were constant, the vibration in the metal floor a reminder of how alive the base was even at 2 in the morning. My crew trusted me. They didn't know about the conversation I had with Brandon. They didn't know I had moved up the mission without the full set of satellite updates, without the weather confirmations, without the quiet assurance I always waited for before taking them into the dark. I tried to convince myself it would be fine, that I could make this work, that maybe this was the moment I needed to finally be seen, to finally prove I was more than the quiet sister who worked in the shadows while Brandon took the spotlight. But I couldn't silence the voice in my head, the one whispering, "This is too soon." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, remembering every briefing I had given, every risk assessment I had written, every line on every map I had studied until the routes lived in my mind. At sunrise, I walked the tarmac, checking the planes, running my hand along the cool metal, breathing in the scent of oil and dust. My team was there, prepping gear, loading supplies, running checks with focused eyes. Lieutenant Harris, my second, came up beside me. "You sure about the timeline, ma'am?" he asked, adjusting his helmet under his arm. I forced a small nod. "It's time," I said, keeping my voice steady. He nodded back, trusting me the way they all did. We lifted off just after dark, the mountains black shapes against a darker sky, the air cold through the cracks in the cockpit, the lights on the dash blinking in quiet rhythm. I watched the ground below, the shapes of roads, the small lights of villages, the shadows that moved where they shouldn't. I called out positions, adjusting flight paths, listening to the steady confirmations in my earpiece as my team followed, trusting, believing. We reached the valley earlier than planned, slipping through the darkness, eyes scanning sensors, tracking radios quiet except for our breathing and the hum of engines. We were supposed to have satellite cover, but the feed was spotty, the images delayed, blurry pieces missing. I felt it in my chest, that tightening, the reminder that we were blind in ways we should not have been. I heard Harris's voice over the comms, "Got movement 2 clicks east." I looked at the grainy feed, seeing shapes, but not enough to confirm. "Hold position," I said, trying to keep the tension out of my voice. But the signal flickered, the shapes disappeared, and I made a choice. "Move in," I said. We dropped lower, the air thicker, the ground closer, the mountains rising like teeth around us. That was when the first flash came, a spark against the darkness, a trail of smoke that turned into fire. "Missile left side," Harris yelled. I banked hard, feeling the G-force press me into my seat, the alarms screaming in my ears, the world spinning as lights flashed red across the panel. Another explosion closer, the shockwave rattling the hull, the radio bursting with shouts and static. We had flown into an ambush, the valley, a trap we couldn't see until it was too late. I heard Harris again, his voice sharp, but then it cut off, replaced by static and the sound of metal tearing. I tried to regain control, pulling up, scanning for survivors, but the smoke was thick, the heat intense, the darkness blinding. The last thing I saw before we broke away was the glow of fire in the valley, the shape of wreckage, burning, the mission shattered in a single moment. I didn't know then, but that decision, that moment, would follow me for the rest of my life. Have you ever felt a moment when you knew everything was about to change? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Because that night in the darkness over the mountains, I made a choice I couldn't take back. We lifted off at 0200 hours, the sky pitch black, promising a nightmare. The engines roared as we took to the air, the cold wind slicing through the open edges of my flight suit. The headset crackled with the voices of my team's steady focus, trusting every word I said. I could see the mountains below, black shadows against a darker sky, the ridges sharp like the edge of a blade. The red glow of our instruments was the only light in the cockpit, each flicker reminding me of the risk I had taken when I moved the mission forward. Lieutenant Harris's voice came over the radio. "Movement detected, Captain. 2 miles north, low speed." I adjusted the flight path, leaning forward, eyes scanning the grainy feed on the screen. There were shapes, faint, moving slow, matching the convoy patterns we had tracked for weeks. "Stay on them," I said. Keep altitude, low minimal noise. Copy that, Harris replied. The air was thin, cold, smelling of fuel and metal, the vibrations of the rotors steady in my bones. My hands tightened on the controls, the edge of my gloves creasing as I adjusted our speed. We flew deeper into the valley, the rocks rising on both sides, shadows swallowing our small convoy of helicopters. The engines hummed softly, but inside my pulse was pounding, matching the rhythm of the warning lights blinking on the console. Suddenly a spark, small but sharp, appeared on the right ridge. Missile right side, Harris yelled. I turned the stick hard, banking left, the G-force slamming me into my seat, alarms screaming, the red lights flashing across my vision. A blast ripped through the air, heat and light filling the darkness, the shockwave shaking the helicopter, metal groaning as I fought to keep control. Smoke filled the cockpit, thick and bitter, making my eyes water as I coughed into my mask. Harris's voice was sharp, panicked. We're hit. We're going down. I saw their chopper veer hard to the right, trailing smoke, fire licking at the tail, the rotors slowing as it spiraled down toward the valley floor. Harris, eject now, I shouted into the mic. Static, a burst of sound, then silence. The explosion was bright, a bloom of orange and red against the black sky, lighting up the rocks, the wreckage visible for a single breath before the darkness swallowed it again. I pulled up, gaining altitude, scanning for other missiles, for movement on the ground, for any sign of Harris and his crew. Nothing but fire below, smoke rising, glowing in the night. My team's voices filled the comms, frantic, calling out positions, injuries, trying to regroup in the chaos. 2 down, Captain. We need to pull back. I swallowed hard, eyes scanning the sensors, the night vision a blur of green and black. Pull back, I ordered, voice cracking but firm. We regroup at Point Delta. Now. We turned, engines straining, leaving behind the fire, the smoke, the pieces of the mission I had thought would save my career. I glanced down one last time, the glow of the wreckage flickering in the darkness, the valley silent except for the echo of the explosion still ringing in my ears. I didn't know it then, but the real damage wasn't just the fire in the valley, it was the silence that would follow me home. The sunrise over Bagram was cold and quiet, the sky pale as ash as I stepped off the helicopter. The ground crew rushed to the bird, checking the damage, the scent of smoke and burned oil still heavy in the air. My boots hit the tarmac and I felt every vibration echo through my bones. I pulled off my helmet, letting the cold air hit my face, the sweat drying on my skin, leaving me chilled. Sergeant Torres met me as I walked toward the hangar, his eyes tight, his mouth a hard line. 2 confirmed dead, Captain, he said quietly. 3 wounded, medevac in progress. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight, the edges of the world sharpening as I tried to hold myself steady. The faces of my team flashed in my mind. Harris's laugh during pre-flight checks, the way he had said, "We've got this, Captain," before we lifted off. I made my way to the debrief room, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt louder than any explosion. Colonel Grant sat at the table, a file open in front of him, his fingers drumming on the pages. "Sit down, Captain Carter," he said. I sat, the chair cold, the metal frame pressing against my spine as I straightened. "Tell me what happened," he said, his eyes not leaving mine. I started to speak, the words coming slow, controlled, each one measured as I explained the mission, the early timeline, the decision to move, the ambush, the explosion. His eyes narrowed when I mentioned the timeline change. "Who authorized the change?" he asked. I hesitated just for a moment. "It was my call, sir," I said. He nodded slowly, writing something down, the pen scratching softly against the paper. "Did anyone advise you to move up the mission?" The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "Captain Brandon Carter suggested it," I said carefully. Colonel Grant paused, his eyes lifting to mine. "Suggested or ordered?" "Suggested, sir," I said, my voice steady even as my stomach turned. He closed the file, leaning back in his chair. "We will be conducting a full review, Captain," he said. "You are to remain on base until further notice." I nodded, standing, saluting before leaving the room. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me again, but it did nothing to clear the heaviness in my chest. I made my way back to the barracks, the halls quiet, the distant sounds of jets taking off and landing the only reminder that the world was still moving. I sat on the edge of my bunk, staring at my boots, the dirt and dust from the mission still clinging to the leather. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with my mother's name. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear. Maddie, her voice soft, trembling. We heard about the mission. I closed my eyes, swallowing. It went bad, Mom, I said. There was a pause, the silence stretching. Your father is disappointed, she said quietly. Brandon is upset too. I felt the words hit sharp, cutting deeper than I expected. Mom, I started, but she interrupted. Maddie, she said, her voice even softer now. It's a stain, honey. On the family. My hands tightened around the phone, my knuckles white, the edges of the device digging into my palm. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. There was another pause, then she said the words that would echo in my mind for years. I'm sorry, Maddie, but Brandon is hurting too. The line clicked, the call ending, leaving me in the quiet hum of the barracks. I stared at the blank screen, the weight of everything pressing down until it felt hard to breathe. I was suspended indefinitely, waiting for a verdict I already knew was coming. But the worst part wasn't losing my command, or the silence from my team. The worst part was realizing that to my family, Brandon's disappointment mattered more than my pain. Have you ever felt alone like that? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Because that was the moment I knew I was on my own. The military calls it administrative leave without pay, but everyone knows it's the end. They made me hand in my badge, my wings, and my name patch. Each item felt like a piece of me stripped away in a quiet room while the base outside moved on without me. No ceremony, no farewell. I left Langley Air Force Base in a borrowed government sedan, my duffel bag on the seat beside me, the Virginia roads blurring as I drove west, trying not to look back. By the time I crossed into Colorado, the snow was falling light and soft, covering everything in quiet. I found a small apartment above a hardware store in Colorado Springs. One bedroom, thin walls, the hum of the heater the only sound at night. I unpacked slowly, lining up my boots, folding my uniform, placing it in the back of the closet. I stared at it for a long time, the empty sleeves hanging there like a ghost I couldn't let go. The days passed in silence. No calls from my parents, no messages from Brandon, no emails from the friends who used to call me for advice before missions. People disappear when you're no longer useful. At night, I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around my legs, the sound of Harris's voice in my ears. Captain, we're going down. I would sit up, gasping the darkness, pressing close, the heater clicking as it worked to push warmth into the room. Sometimes I would hear the rotor blades, the scream of alarms, the explosion replaying over and over, until I pressed my hands against my ears. One night, I sat on the floor, my back against the cold wall, the moonlight coming through the thin curtains, and I asked myself the question I had been avoiding. What really happened that night? They told me I was reckless, that I moved too soon, that I was responsible for the deaths of my team. But I remembered Brandon's words, the pressure in his voice, the promise that this would be my chance to prove myself. I remembered how he had told me he would handle command, that he would take the heat if it went wrong. And he didn't. That thought stayed with me, growing louder each day until I couldn't ignore it. So I started looking. I didn't have clearance anymore, but I still had contacts, people who owed me favors, people who still believed I was worth listening to. I asked for mission logs, for satellite pass records, for weather reports. I spent hours at the public library using old connections to access secure files, working quietly, carefully. I found fragments of emails, notes in after-action reports, pieces that didn't fit with the story they had given me. Late one night, while the snow fell heavy outside, I found it. An email from Brandon to Colonel Reeves dated 2 days before the mission. Recommend moving up the operation window. Trust me. I will assume full responsibility if issues arise. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking, the glow of the laptop lighting up the dark room. He had told them he would take the responsibility. And then he let me burn instead. I leaned back in the chair, the cold from the window seeping into my skin, the snow outside falling thicker, now coating the empty street in silence. I read the email again, word for word, like it might change if I blinked. Recommend moving up the operation window. Trust me. I will assume full responsibility if issues arise. Brandon's name at the bottom, clear, confident, the same way he signed off on everything. I could hear his voice in my head, calm and easy, the way he always sounded when he wanted something. I'll take the heat if it goes wrong, Maddie. Don't worry. Except he didn't. I closed the laptop, pressing my palms against my eyes until I saw stars, my breath shaking as I let the truth settle in. Brandon had pushed me to move up the mission. He had told Command it was his call, that he would own it. But when everything fell apart, he stayed quiet, letting me take the fall, letting me be the scapegoat while he kept his hands clean. I stood up, pacing the small room, the floor creaking under my boots, the old wood complaining with each step. My mind ran through every moment, every look he gave me, every word he said in that hangar, convincing me this was the right call. I had trusted him. I had believed that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment I would finally prove myself. Instead, I had walked my team into a trap, and I carried the weight of their deaths alone. My phone buzzed on the table, jolting me out of my thoughts. A message from an unknown number. "You're not crazy. You deserve the truth." Attached was a file, encrypted, marked as classified. I knew the format. I had seen it 100 times before. My hands moved before I could think, decrypting the file, watching the loading bar crawl across the screen as the heater rattled in the corner, fighting against the cold. Satellite images, mission briefings, internal messages, and at the center of it, Brandon's email tied to a chain of approvals that had never reached my desk. I scrolled through, my eyes catching on a message from a logistics officer. "Are you sure about this timeline? Captain Carter says he'll handle the fallout." The words felt like a slap. Captain Carter. My brother. I saw the date. 2 days before the mission. I realized then that Brandon had made the decision, had pulled the strings, and when it all went wrong, he let me stand there alone, stripped of everything, while he moved on to his next promotion. I sank into the chair, the file open in front of me, the snow falling outside like ashes. I wasn't wrong. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't reckless. I was set up to take the blame so he could keep his spotless record. The heater clicked off, leaving the room quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones. I stared at the screen, my reflection, looking back, tired eyes, hollow cheeks, the ghost of who I had been before that mission. And in that silence, one truth became clear. I had been pushed into the fire, but it was Brandon who had lit the match. Have you ever discovered a betrayal that changed everything? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Because that was the moment I knew the only way out was to fight back. You don't need a gun to fight, you just need the truth. I spent nights at that small kitchen table, papers spread out, the glow of the laptop the only light in the room. Coffee went cold next to my elbow as I matched timestamps, cross-checked reports, tied Brandon's emails to mission changes that cost lives. Each click of the mouse felt like a drumbeat, steady, keeping me from slipping back into those dark nights when I heard Harris's last words in my sleep. I printed the final report on a borrowed printer downstairs, the ink smudging under my thumb as I stacked each page carefully. Satellite images, mission briefs, email chains, the proof they never wanted me to find. On the last page, I typed a single line before I sent it. Truth matters even when no one is watching. I addressed the package to the Office of Military Ethics. No return address, no explanations, just the file and those 6 words. I sealed it, dropped it at the post office in the cold dawn, and walked away. After that, I logged off social media. I turned off my phone for days at a time, letting the battery drain on the nightstand. I stopped checking my email, stopped waiting for the world to remember me. I ran in the mornings, the cold air burning in my lungs, the streets of Colorado Springs empty under the pale light. I counted steps, breaths, heartbeats, letting the rhythm keep me steady. Sometimes I would sit by the window watching the snow fall, wondering if it was over. Wondering if this was all I would ever be. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into 3 months, the waiting like a quiet ache I couldn't shake. Then one morning the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before I picked it up, pressing it to my ear, holding my breath. Maddie, the voice said, calm, familiar, strong. Colonel Harper. I felt my knees weaken and I sat down on the edge of the bed. Sir, I said, my voice barely there. We got your file, he said. We reviewed everything. You were right, Maddie. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. Your record has been corrected. You're cleared. You can return if you choose to. The silence after those words felt like a sunrise after a long, cold night. I let out a breath. I didn't know I was holding the tears coming hot and sharp falling onto my hands as I covered my face. But these weren't the tears of someone broken. They were the tears of someone free. I wiped my eyes with the sleeve of my sweatshirt, my breath shaking, the phone warm in my hand. "Thank you, sir," I managed to say, my voice raw small in the quiet room. Colonel Harper paused, his voice softer now. "You earned this, Maddie. You never stopped fighting for the truth." I closed my eyes, letting his words settle, letting them fill the empty spaces that had grown inside me since that night in the valley. "We'll handle the rest," he said. "Take your time, but when you're ready, we'd be proud to have you back." "Yes, sir," I whispered. The call ended and I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone until it stopped, leaving me with the sound of my own breathing. I stood up, walking to the window, looking out at the street below. Snow was falling again, soft flakes catching in the morning light, drifting onto the empty road, covering everything in clean white. I thought about Harris, about the others we lost, about the weight I had carried for so long. The guilt, the blame, the silence. It was still there, but it felt lighter now, like I could breathe without it crushing my chest. I pulled the uniform from the back of the closet, the fabric cold, the patches still sewn on the name tag that once felt like a lie, now heavy in my hand, but in a way that felt right. Madison Carter. It was more than a name. It was a promise. I sat on the floor, the uniform draped over my knees, my fingers tracing the stitching, remembering every moment that led me here. Every early morning run on base, every briefing I led with a quiet voice, every mission I flew while others slept, every moment I thought I would break but didn't. I wasn't the same Maddie who walked into that mission desperate for approval, hungry to be seen. That Maddie was gone. I folded the uniform carefully, placing it back in the closet, but this time it wasn't hidden in the back. It was waiting. The snow kept falling, and I stood there, letting the quiet fill me, letting the cold remind me that I was still here, that I still had more to do. I turned on my phone, scrolling past the missed calls, the old messages, the ones from family that I wasn't ready to answer yet. I opened a blank note, typing out the plan, the steps I would take, the next chapter I would write for myself. Because coming back didn't mean going back. I wasn't returning to be who I was before. I was returning to become who I was meant to be. Have you ever fought for the truth when no one believed you? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Because this time I would walk back into that world and they would see me. The day they wouldn't let me into that promotion ceremony, I promised myself it would never happen again. Now no one could stop me. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of my uniform, the silver eagle pins on my shoulders catching the morning light coming through the hotel window. Colonel Madison Carter. I took a breath, steady and calm, letting it fill my lungs, before I turned away, grabbing my cover and sliding it under my arm. Outside, the air was crisp, the Colorado sky wide and clear as I stepped into the car waiting to take me to the base. They were hosting the Air Division anniversary, a ceremony honoring those who had served and sacrificed, the room filled with men and women who understood what it meant to carry weight in silence. The invitation had arrived a month ago, official heavy paper, my name printed clearly across the top. Colonel Madison Carter, guest of honor. I remembered standing outside the glass doors years ago, holding an invitation that meant nothing, watching my family celebrate Brandon while I was left outside. This time, the doors would open for me. The car pulled up to the main hall, the flags waving gently in the breeze, the sound of distant jets rumbling across the runway. I stepped out, straightening my uniform, the polished shoes clicking against the concrete as I walked toward the entrance. The young airman at the check-in table stood at attention as I approached, his eyes scanning the list before looking up at me. "Welcome, Colonel Carter," he said, his voice firm, respect clear in his tone. "Thank you, Airman," I replied, nodding once before stepping through the doors. Inside, the hall was warm, filled with the low hum of voices, the soft clink of glasses, the scent of coffee and polished wood. I paused for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, letting the moment settle in my bones, and then I saw them. My parents standing near the front, my mother adjusting my father's tie, her hand brushing against his chest before she looked around, her eyes landing on me. Brandon was there too, in his dress blues, his posture perfect, the same easy smile he always wore when he wanted the room to notice him. And they did notice him the way they always had. But this time their eyes turned to me. And for the first time they didn't look away. I walked deeper into the hall, the medals on my uniform catching the soft light, the quiet hush that followed me louder than any applause. People turned, conversations pausing as eyes found me, recognizing the name, the rank, the presence. My mother's hand fell from my father's tie, her fingers curling against her palm as she looked at me, her lips parting, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. My father stood straighter, but this time it wasn't for Brandon. Brandon's eyes met mine, his smile faltering for the first time in years, the easy confidence cracking just enough for me to see the truth behind it. I held his gaze steady, calm, letting him see that I wasn't the same Maddie who once needed his approval, who once waited for him to notice her. A young officer approached, his uniform crisp, his shoes shining, his steps careful as he stopped in front of me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "This way, please." I nodded, following him past rows of chairs, past tables where officers and their families sat, where hands paused in midair, where whispers filled the space I left behind. At the front of the hall, a table had been prepared, a seat marked with my name, my rank waiting for me. Colonel Madison Carter. I placed my cover on the table, smoothing the fabric, letting my hand rest there for a moment, grounding myself. I looked out across the room, seeing the faces, the uniforms, the families, the quiet pride, the silent respect. And I saw my family standing there, no longer able to look away, no longer able to pretend I didn't belong. A hush fell over the hall as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, his voice clear as he began to read the names of those being honored. The stories of missions flown, lives saved, sacrifices made. Each name was met with applause, with nods, with quiet pride. And then he paused, lifting his eyes to the crowd. "And now," he said, "we honor a leader who returned from a false accusation, who fought for the truth when it was easier to stay silent, who rose to command with strength, precision, and integrity." A murmur moved through the room, heads turning, eyes shifting, and I felt the weight of every moment that led to this. "Please rise," he said, his voice steady. "Colonel Madison Carter." Chairs scraped back, people stood, the sound filling the hall, the applause starting soft, then building until it filled every corner, every space, until it felt like the room itself was breathing with me. I stood there, letting the moment settle, letting it wash over me, letting it remind me that this was not the end of my story. I glanced at Brandon, at my parents, at the faces I once thought I needed to prove myself to, and I realized I didn't need their approval anymore. I had earned this. And then from the side of the stage, a voice called out, strong and clear, cutting through the applause. "Welcome, General Carter. Have you ever stepped back into a place that once shut you out? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this." Because that day I walked into that room as someone they could never ignore again. I used to wait for a seat at their table. Now I've built my own. I stood at the podium, the lights warm on my face, the hush of the hall wrapping around me like a breath I finally let out. I looked across the room, seeing uniforms lined in rows, faces waiting, watching, expecting a speech about service, sacrifice, duty. But they were going to get the truth. I cleared my throat, letting my eyes sweep over the crowd, letting them see me. There was a time, I said, when I stood outside a door just like this, wearing this same uniform, holding an invitation that meant nothing. I paused, letting the silence carry the weight of every moment that had brought me here. They told me I wasn't on the list, that I wasn't welcome, that my name didn't belong inside. I saw heads tilt, eyes shifting, the air in the room tightening around us, and for a long time I believed them. My hands rested on the edges of the podium, steady, strong. But I didn't come back to ask for forgiveness. I came back because I deserved to be here. The words left my mouth, calm, clear, and final. I glanced toward the side of the hall where my parents stood, my mother's hand covering her mouth, tears running down her cheeks, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold it in. My father stood beside her, his face unreadable, his hands clenched behind his back, his eyes on the floor. And Brandon. He stepped forward, his face pale, the confident smirk gone, replaced with something I hadn't seen before. Regret. "Maddie." He said, his voice rough, small in the vast hall. "I'm sorry." The room seemed to shrink, the sound of his words hanging in the air, echoing in the space between us. I looked at him, letting the silence speak before I did. "I don't hate you, Brandon," I said, my voice steady, "but I won't forget." He nodded, his eyes falling, the apology unspoken but understood. I turned back to the crowd, letting the moment close around us, the lights soft, the air heavy, with the truth I had carried alone for too long. Brandon opened his mouth like he wanted to say more, but no words came. His hands hung useless at his sides, the sleeves of his dress blues too perfect for a man who had let so many carry his silence. My mother took a shaky step forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor, echoing in the quiet. "Madison," she whispered, her voice cracking, tears streaking her makeup, leaving pale trails down her cheeks. I held her gaze, seeing the woman who used to braid my hair before school, the woman who once told me, "Be quiet, let your brother speak." Now she stood there, seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. "I'm sorry," she choked out, pressing a hand to her chest. "We didn't know, we didn't listen." My father's jaw tightened, his eyes lifting, meeting mine, the same cold blue I saw in the mirror every morning. "You made us proud, Maddie," he said, his voice stiff, as if each word cost him more than the medals he wore on his chest. Proud. That word I had chased like a ghost for so long. I nodded once, acknowledging the words, letting them land, but not letting them break me open again. I turned back to the crowd, clearing my throat, letting my hand rest flat on the podium. "You don't owe anyone your silence," I said, my voice steady. "You don't owe them your fear, your smallness, your waiting." I let my eyes move across the faces, young officers standing in the back, veterans with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much, families clutching the hands of children who would one day grow into this uniform. I used to believe I needed to earn a place at someone else's table. That if I worked hard enough, was quiet enough, loyal enough, they would let me in. I paused, letting the hush deepen, letting the truth reach every corner of the hall. But the truth is, you don't need to wait for a seat at someone else's table. You can build your own. My voice didn't shake, not even when I saw my mother cover her mouth to hold back a sob, not even when Brandon lowered his eyes, not even when my father's lips pressed into a thin line, regret and pride battling in the silence. I stepped back from the podium, letting the words linger, letting them fill the space, letting everyone in that room carry them home. The applause started soft at first, then rising, filling the hall until it vibrated in my chest, in my bones, in every piece of me that had once been told to stay quiet. I let it wash over me, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that I was done waiting to be invited. I had built my own table, and I would never forget how it felt to stand here, seen, unshakable, and finally free. When the ceremony ended, people lined up to shake my hand, some with tears in their eyes, others with quiet nods that said they understood. A young woman in uniform stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held mine. "Ma'am," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saying what we're all afraid to say." I squeezed her hand, looking into her eyes. "You don't need permission to be who you are," I told her. "You never did." She nodded, wiping her eyes before stepping back into the crowd. I felt the weight of the room lessen, the air clearer as people moved, talking softly, the tension that once held them cracking open like dawn breaking over a cold field. I saw Brandon standing by the back doors, away from the crowd, his hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes fixed on the floor. I walked toward him, each step measured, the echo of my boots reminding me I didn't owe him anything, but I was going to say what needed to be said. When I stopped in front of him, he finally lifted his head, his eyes red, the confident smirk gone, replaced by something raw, human, stripped of every layer he had used to shield himself. "Maddie," he said, his voice rough. "I don't expect you to forgive me." I studied him, seeing the boy who once showed me how to ride a bike, the teenager who teased me when I cried, the man who let me take the fall for something he started. "I don't hate you, Brandon," I said, my voice quiet but strong. "But I won't forget." His shoulders slumped a breath, leaving him like he had been holding it for years. "I know," he whispered. I glanced past him, seeing my parents waiting, my mother's hands clasped together, her eyes swollen from crying, my father standing stiff, his jaw tight but his eyes softer than I remembered. I nodded at them, a silent acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing less. Then I turned, walking past them, stepping through the doors into the cool night air, the sky above, clear, the stars sharp and bright against the dark. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold, letting it settle into my bones, reminding me that I was alive, that I had made it here on my own terms. I tilted my head back, looking at the stars, the same stars I had watched from cockpits, from dusty roads in the Middle East, from the cold window of a Colorado apartment where I rebuilt myself piece by piece. I whispered to the night, to the girl I once was. You don't need them to say your name. You know who you are now. The doors behind me opened, the sounds of the ceremony spilling out before fading as the doors closed again. I didn't look back. Have you ever stepped forward even when the world told you to stay small? What would you have done if you were me? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Because in that moment, under that endless sky, I knew one truth that would never leave me. I didn't need a seat at their table. Because I had built my own.